Thank you for being here in Mr. Rogers' original neighborhood. When Fred was thinking of a place to continue his legacy, he had the wonderful blessing of a friendship by Archabbot Douglas Nowicki, who convinced him to come here and continue his early childhood advocacy in his original neighborhood. And so we've been blessed with the opportunity to carry forward Fred's legacy. And so tonight, we are going to do some reflection on the neighborhood. We're going to hear some insights from some wonderful experts who know Fred's life and work very well. And as you watch the original public episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and you start to think of some questions, hold on to those, because we are going to have some time for some questions and answers at the end of this panel. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage St. Vincent College President, Brother Norman Hips.
On one of Fred's shows, he said, perhaps two of the best two words to learn is to say, thank you. So I simply say thank you to Karen and her staff, to our moderator, Paul, and our panelists, Marge and David and Junlei. Thank you to our faculty and students, particularly the red-sweated Fred Rogers scholars. Okay? And thank you all for being here for this evening. May it be a wonderful evening together. Thank you.
It was exactly 50 years ago today when that episode aired and children's television history was made. And I hope, judging by the laughter I heard in the audience tonight, that as many children were delighted back in 1968 as adults were this evening. And I think that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood carries many unique and special messages for all of us. When you're a child, you interpret them one way. When you hear them as an adult, you think of them very differently. And so tonight we are going to host a panel discussion delving into Fred Rogers' work, his legacy, some of the history of the show, and ultimately how he managed to inspire us and keep us talking about this wonderful thing that he did 50 years later. So I'm very delighted tonight to have Paul Guggenheimer here as the moderator of our panel. And Paul hosted programs on WESA for many, many years and has had numerous recognitions throughout the Pittsburgh community for his interviews, and has most recently delved into a new creative project called Primal Interviews, and it's taking his work and extending it by doing much more in-depth interviews than he's done before. So we're very excited to see him grow professionally and of course be with us here tonight. So I'd like to welcome Paul to the stage as our moderator.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. Hi, everybody. You know, in keeping with the spirit of 1968, I wore my Chelsea boots with the Cuban heel, which were famously worn by the Beatles, which is why they're commonly referred to as Beatle boots. So I want to introduce our very wonderful guests joining us for conversation this evening, starting with Margaret M. Petruska. This is the last time I'm going to call her Margaret. She likes to be called Marge. She retired in 2016 from a position of Senior Director of the Children, Youth, and Families Program for the Heinz Endowments, which is a family-based foundation in Pittsburgh. In 1994, she helped to shape a $1 million challenge grant approved by the Heinz Endowments boards that created the Early Childhood Initiative, a bold, ambitious effort to marshal private and public resources to organize an early learning system that would provide high quality, developmentally appropriate education to low-income children around the country. Early in her career, Marge was a teacher, child therapist, and program director for autistic children. She also served in policy positions in state and county government, working on issues such as child abuse and children's mental health. In 2005, Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, a national organization of grant makers, honored Ms. Petruska with the Fred Rogers Leadership Award in Philanthropy for Children, Youth, and Families for her leadership and strategic grant making that has benefited children nationwide. Please welcome Marge Petruska.
David, I'm way in the back.
It's like the Tonight Show, just take a seat on the couch and just keep sliding on down. All right, next I'd like to welcome Junlei Li. He is the Fred Rogers Center co-director and resident faculty member. Junlei integrates the mission of the center, the college, and child-serving partners in our larger community. His research lab incubator 143 partners with educators, trainers, advocates, and researchers with active projects in low-income child care centers, urban schools, community programs, and the larger child-serving nonprofit sector. The incubators focus on identifying and amplifying the simple active ingredient that universally helps serve children. The power of human connection. Junlei joined the center after serving as the principal research scientist at the Fred Rogers Company, director of applied research and evaluation at University of Pittsburgh Office of Child Development, and principal investigator on federal research grants at Carnegie Mellon University. Please welcome from right here on the St. Vincent College campus, Junlei Li. And last but not least, he insists on saying least, but I don't think so. Mr. David Bianculli, creator of TV Worth Watching and a Fred Rogers Center advisor. David Bianculli has been the TV critic for National Public Radio's Fresh Air with Terry Gross, so he's a familiar voice. He appears as an occasional guest host on Fresh Air, has done so since 1987. Beginning in 1975, he's worked as a TV critic for newspapers in Florida, Ohio, right here in Pennsylvania, New York, most recently for the New York Daily News from 1993 to 2007. Currently, he is the editor of the website TV Worth Watching, which he launched in 2007. David has written 4 books: The Platinum Age of Television, From I Love Lucy to The Walking Dead, How TV Became Terrific, Dangerously Funny, The Uncensored Story of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, read that one, it's a great one, Teleliteracy, Taking Television Seriously, and Dictionary of Teleliteracy. He now teaches TV and film as a tenured professor at Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey. And David, as I mentioned, is a member of the Fred Rogers Center National Advisory Council. Please welcome Mr. David Bianculli.
Way too long. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So they're all here. So let's start by talking about what we have just seen. The first nationally televised episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Not the first, because he was doing it locally on Channel 13, but starting in 1968, becoming a national phenomenon. So what impressions are we coming away with? Let's just go around. Whoever wants to jump in first. What did you think? Marge, David, Junlei, somebody.
Well, these guys do everything for children. My job is, if you do something for children and put it on TV, I can tell you whether I like it or not. So my job is to say, I like that very much. You know, back then in 1968, it was really different. It was really slower. And Fred had been doing this a long time. He'd been doing it locally on the show. He'd done it out of a Canadian show before that. And then he'd done it as the puppeteer and one of the cast members and major formulators of Children's Corner, which started in the 50s in Pittsburgh. And so did many of the puppets. And so did I. I was born in Pittsburgh in 1953. I'm old. But I was just at the right age to watch Fred without even knowing that he was Fred, because he was just hiding behind the puppets then. But I knew the puppets and knew the voices. And then by the time this goes national, I was 15. I had nothing to do with Fred Rogers as a teenager. But I did shortly after that, and then I became a parent. And Fred Rogers was one of the only shows that I watched, allowed my kids to watch, and now they have kids, and they're doing the same thing with DVDs and whatever they can grab in terms of streaming or what I send. So I'm actually living proof of 3 generations of people under his spell. And the spell starts with what you just saw. My favorite part of it is when he said, "Can you read or write? If you can't, you will soon." And it's just so affirming, and it's such a direct conversation. He's like Michael Caine. He never blinks when he's looking into the camera. It's an amazing guy.
Go ahead, Marge.
Okay, you want to say? I had seen this yesterday, and I sat for a couple minutes after this about 29-minute episode, and just kind of shook my head because I can't remember. It's been a long time since I walked away from a 29-minute show feeling good, laughing throughout it, feeling such decency come across this powerful medium, feeling affirmed, feeling an eminent fairness. And some of these themes will be repeated for the next 50 years. An unequivocal kindness and patience. There was something kind about what he said, and so patient, a decency, an acceptance. And I just sat there and said, we are so blessed to have had, how many years? Shows. How many shows, Margaret?
31 years, was it? How many, Karen? 31.
31. I was going to say 32. I gave him 1 extra year. I wish we had 1 extra year, but that's what I was left with. I felt so good yesterday after watching the show.
Yeah, there's so many amazing things, and there's also a harmonic convergence that I'm going to ask you guys about later. But Junlei, talk about what happens. There's a whole theme that he introduces here about change, which, let's face it, into adulthood. I mean, change is a daunting thing, as hard as it is for us to deal with now as grown-ups. As for kids, it's a tough thing. So it's kind of amazing that he, going right into that first show, he's picking up on this thing that kids are anxious about and somehow decides, okay, I'm going to address this. So my question to you, Junlei, is what happens as these episodes progress, particularly during this week, with the whole thing with King Friday acting persnickety? He's got that wall, which becomes a very prominent part of what's to come in the subsequent shows.
Well, I think one of the first things I just wanted to share with all of you is, when you watch an episode like that, you all have different reactions. Like, I would love for this to, if we had a discussion, I would imagine every one of you sees something different. And that was something that Fred often said, which is that what you take away with is not entirely dependent on the producer or the speaker. It's what you bring with you when you're sitting there. And Fred, I think, was very conscious of what children and what families bring with them when they sit in front of the television. And he used to say that about sermons too, because he was a Presbyterian minister. But in this particular episode, typically the neighborhood episode are 5 episodes in a row, and it becomes something like a theme week. And so this was the beginning of it. And in this episode, you already see, I think, 2 really important themes of Fred's work. One is, you notice the topic is change, but that Fred showed a variety of reactions to change, right? So King Friday was angry, X the Hour was really excited, and Henrietta was shy, right? There was these different reactions of change, and one of the things I think Fred really wanted to convey to grown-ups as well as to children is that when something happens, you can feel about it in a variety of ways, and it's okay to have these different expressions of feeling, so long as these expressions don't hurt yourself and don't hurt somebody else, and that it's what you do with these feelings that matters. And the other part of this theme is, I don't know if you noticed or not, but Fred said, in very different ways, but in one particular case, he said, it's the people that makes the place. I think was so important to Fred in the days of television or even in the days of computers and so on, that nothing replaces people. And that there's something deep and important about people that doesn't change, even if the things that are around you that are changing. And I think one of the things that make children and make grown-ups anxious is when the world around them changes, they feel like a part of themselves are gonna change and they're gonna lose sight of who they are. And Fred was reassuring not only the children, but the grown-ups, that even if the world around you changes, that people doesn't change, and so long as people doesn't change, then the place can stay the same. Now to answer Paul's question, if you have an opportunity, it's really interesting. So if you have Amazon membership, you can actually go in and watch the rest of the episodes, because I wonder, you might be wondering, like, how is this gonna play out? So just keep in mind, this was 1968, and this was aired this day. So in January 1968, there was a major escalation in Vietnam War. So when Fred was writing the script in 1967, war was looming, right, as a bigger backdrop of the United States. And 1968 will turn out to be a year of change too, because later on that year was when Dr. King was killed, and a few months later, Bobby Kennedy was killed. And so if you look at the broader historical cultural context, it was a time where grown-ups have trouble dealing with the changes that were happening in America. But in these particular episodes, I believe in episode 2, you get to see King Friday really angry. And for the rest of the whole week, what King Friday essentially did is, I think King Friday launched a war against change. And so much so that King Friday drafted people in the neighborhood to be border guards, to keep out change and troublemakers in the neighborhood, including his own niece, Lady Evelyn, that everyone who comes to the castle have to give their name, rank, ID, serial number.
It sounds familiar.
But in the end, you notice that it was, so you saw Daniel Tiger there. Daniel Tiger, we don't know how old Daniel is, but Daniel seemed to be the youngest of the neighborhood. But it was Daniel who came up with the idea that if we tie words like peace and love to these balloons, and if we send these balloons over, if the neighborhood could be filled with these ideas, we can avert war, and then we can put some of the changes back, keep some of the changes, but that we can be a peaceful neighborhood again. And that was how that week ended. So I don't want to give you too many details if you have a chance to watch it. It's really neat in today's day and age to go back and then watch how that week panned out.
Well, it's very interesting what when you put into context what is going on in history at that time. And it's odd because this man who created this television concept of sanctuary at the same time, every day for children, in a year of such amazing social upheaval and as much turmoil as we've seen in the world in the last 50 years, there really hasn't been a year, I don't think, quite like that one. And David, and Junlei was talking about this earlier. He mentioned, the war, the assassination of Martin Luther King, which happened a couple months after this episode aired, and then 4 months after this episode aired, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Mr. Rogers sought to reassure children, as you pointed out in one of your recent pieces. He sought to assure children reassured children after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy in one particular episode. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it astounds me. It astounds me so much that I make these electronic noises. Because what happens with Fred Rogers throughout the series is that he's so empathic, so concerned with how children will feel, that he wants to talk to them on their level, even if they shouldn't understand things, don't understand things, but they're like little canaries in coal mines, and their homes are the coal mines. And so if their parents are upset, if their older siblings are upset, these little kids can pick up on that. And so Fred often addressed these kinds of fears. And so I could be twisted, but my very favorite episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was a primetime special he did in the summer of '68, where he wanted parents to watch with their children, and basically said, this is a trying time. They may have fears. You may have talked to them. You may not have talked to them, but we're going to have, characters in the neighborhood of make-believe talk. And so just imagine this, if you haven't seen it. Lady Aberlin is talking with Daniel Tiger, and Daniel Tiger brings out a balloon and asks her to blow it up. And she blows it up. And then he asks her to let the air out of it. And this takes 2 minutes of TV time. And she does that. It's like, okay. Then he asks her to do it again. Blows up the air again. The air goes out. And you wonder, okay, even by 1968 standards, this is pretty slow television. But it's fascinatingly slow television. And then Daniel Tiger, this little hand puppet, says, and this is a direct quote, "What does assassination mean?" And it leads to a discussion about what had happened in the real world just the day before, with Bobby Kennedy being shot and killed. Now, what's really pointed, and I think brilliant, is that Daniel Tiger, and thus Fred, never use the name Bobby Kennedy. They say that man. That's what happened to that man. And it's just, I dare you, we can talk about this afterwards, I dare you to name a single children's host on television today who would either think it was important enough to address it that way, or to do it so brilliantly and lovingly. It amazes me. I show it to my college students each term. It freaks them out. Because they're in their 20s now, but they still know and love Fred Rogers, but they haven't seen this clip. And it's like, what is that? And they're fascinated by it. It is raw honesty and giving kids such credit at such a young age to be able to confront and just deal with, or at least start to explore.
Marge, you got to know Fred Rogers quite a bit. I think one of the questions that comes up, one of the things that we wonder about Fred Rogers, I never met him. So to me, he's this guy who was on TV, as he was for a number of kids all around the country watching him. How did Fred Rogers, what do we know about his upbringing? How did Fred Rogers get to be Fred Rogers, this adult who could key in so brilliantly to what children needed in terms of being engaged in such a gentle way? Because not everybody could do this, but he somehow came together as a mature adult and acquired these skills. What made Fred Rogers Fred Rogers? How did he come to be Mr. Rogers?
If many of you read the paper yesterday and know a bit about Fred, certainly his family and early years had some influence. There's a piece of all of us that are influenced by our particular situations growing up. He was an only child. He had a mother that really worried and kind of fretted about him, and when he would play outside, she kind of controlled some of that free time that most of us might have had, just climbing trees and running away, and the parents maybe not knowing quite where we were. He was not well for a period of time as a child, so there was a lot of time he spent alone. And I think some of that contributes to, he loved music. He played the piano at a very young age, and he talks very positively about his grandfather and the relationship with his grandfather, and how his grandfather really might have been the one, if I remember correctly, that said when Fred was leaving the home one day, sorry about you all from this side, Fred, I like you just the way you are. That acceptance and that comment from his grandfather obviously stayed with him. I have a story, so somewhere in all of that, and again being influenced throughout his years, and Margie, you probably know a lot of this more than I do. He spent a lot of time with a really preeminent child psychologist at the University of Pittsburgh, Margaret McFarland. And it was those conversations and that time with her that he was able to gain real insight into child development. And you see in this first episode such careful developmental concepts up and down, and later on in that 29-minute video he repeats it again, up and down, just the simplicity of how he interprets. Many of us in this room and elsewhere know child development theory. I don't so much. But to put it into practice in words like he did was truly amazing, and to make children feel so safe. Maybe he didn't feel so safe growing up, and so accepted and valued and cherished. So let me give two minutes, if I could, of a story.
Sure.
So Fred was very helpful to me. In 1993, I had worked for almost 10 years with the Family Communication, which was the precursor to now Fred Rogers Company, in doing a lot of grant making with Fred and the talented staff that he had. So I got to know him professionally and got to know his staff professionally. And if we have a minute later, the videos that we did with Fred over many, many years, if you haven't seen some of them, were unbelievable. On racism, on how to talk to a young child whose parent was mentally ill, on relationships, the list goes on. But so I went, who would I go to when I knew I was doing a very scary thing as a single parent, to adopt a young 5-year-old from an orphanage in St. Petersburg, Russia. And I had a lot of friends in the early childhood field, friends that were psychologists. I was a therapist at one point in my life. But when something this big and important
Change.
Thank you. That's a good way to get that in. I was going on in my life, and I was still obviously at the Heinz Endowments. I just looked for information wherever I could, and who better to go to than my friend now and colleague, but Fred Rogers. And he knew. I said to Fred, I'm really scared about this. I don't know, what I'm getting into. I know sort of all the theoretical issues. I'm adopting a 5-year-old. Are you kidding me? I know it's better sometimes when you get children earlier, so a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old, and I might have more time to put some developmental goodness into her, but this is a 5-year-old who had been in a pretty custodial orphanage and was born less than 2 pounds. And so, what do I do? What words of advice? He gave me lots of encouragements, lots of acceptance, and but his word of advice to me was, when you go to that orphanage, Marge, ask who she knew and liked, and who liked her. What caregiver spent more time with her? See if you can't find out. And when you get that person's name, find that caregiver and tell her what you would like her to do. And what he told me he would like me to do and her to do is tell Julia, and that's the name of my daughter, that it is okay to leave with this woman that you don't know. You will feel safe with her. She'll take care of you. And it's okay to leave this place that you've been, in, not exactly these words, but that you've been living in for 5 years. I did that. I found the caregiver. She hugged Julia. She gave permission for Julia to leave with me. And I don't know how I'm going to weave this back to how Fred is Fred growing up, but that ability to make me feel safe and Julia to leave with me so that she could feel safe and accepted is a gift, I think, that Fred had and shared with some of us personally and many of us through the medium of television. 10 years later, let's see, she was 5 when I adopted her, 15, 10, 11 years later, as a high school project, Julia raised $10,000 by selling her photography and pottery to build a playground at her baby home, 3, in St. Petersburg. And the woman caretaker that gave her permission to go with me was there and sobbing to see Julia giving back that gift of a playground.
Wow.
You know,
I'll top that.
yeah. That's wonderful. I think that tells us a lot of what we might need to know about how Fred Rogers became Fred Rogers. And, you know, a lot of that comes across, certainly in the show. When he's testing the swing, he goes up on the step, I'm going to make sure this chain holds, so when you sit on it, even though nobody's going to actually get to sit on it, but, you know, he takes the make-believe that far into the episode that, you know, it's okay because this will hold you, you're going to be safe. And the other thing I loved about the end of that show is where he says, I'll be thinking about you, because think about when you're a kid and you're watching something on television that you're enamored with, especially when you're connecting with a character. And when the person goes away, you know, I mean, as a kid, I used to think, I wonder what they do when they're not with me, you know? They're thinking about me. He's thinking about me. That's such a cool thing that he would know to say. He's probably thinking, the kid probably is wondering, watching this, you know, where does Mr. Rogers go? Well, he's going to be thinking about me, and he'll be back here, and he'll be looking forward to seeing me. So there's this harmonic convergence. Fred Rogers, there's this, I don't know if it's divine intervention, inspiration. For whatever reason, Fred Rogers happens to be born at just the right time, that he's coming of age as an adult, just as television is coming into being as a mainstream, or even before it became a mainstream thing in America, just as it's beginning to exist as the network television that we know today. And so, David or Junlei, give some insight into how Fred Rogers grows with the medium of television to the point that where by the 1960s, when everybody has a TV, boom, here comes Fred Rogers and he's ready to shine.
You go, I'll pick up scraps.
I like that.
I think Fred didn't start off in television.
Right.
So he was really interested in music and ministry. And so he was going to study, he did study music composition at Rollins College in Florida, and he was going to go on to the seminary. So it was almost by accident, I think, in the very early 50s that he came home right here to Latrobe and saw his own family have a television set. I think it hit him with two reactions. One is, what a wonderful device, right? And two is, what awful things are on this wonderful device. And I think that was what eventually led Fred to go into television. He started as a floor manager at NBC
And
in New York.
explain to people what a floor manager does.
He called it, he's the gopher, which means people just tell Fred, go for this, go for that. And he jokes, well, this is true, he's colorblind. But as a stage manager, you have to go get certain props. So on the first day on the job, someone said, go get this purple cloud. He goes into the set room. There's all these cutout clouds, and he couldn't tell which one's the purple one. And he said he was the first colorblind floor manager for the first color television program at NBC. So, but I think when WQED were getting started as the very first public television program in the United States in here, I think one, because it's in Pittsburgh, and two, he just felt that everything he knew, he was called to come back here and to serve. And a lot of his colleagues thought he was crazy because he was online to be promoted into a producer in the golden age of television. He has this beautiful career ahead of him, but he dropped everything. And he said, you're going to a show, you're going to a station that's not even on the air, right? And right here in our students' lab, there's a desk. That was the desk that Fred's father had right here in Latrobe, and when he started working at WQED, they moved this desk from here over there because WQED had nothing. They didn't even have a desk. And so I think that was kind of how Fred got into it. I think Fred grew with the medium, but at some point, he also, I think in a way, refused to go where the medium went. So starting from the 1970s, particularly the 80s and so, you can imagine what Fred called the bombardment of cartoons start to come in. And there are those who are in the television business who, well-intentioned, was trying to give Fred some advice. If you speed up the show a little bit, can you consider some animated sequences within the show? Fred didn't want to do it. I think the pace of the show is what you saw here if you watched it in the 90s, even into the 2000s. And it's easier to say, now that, well, Fred was so famous he can do anything he wants. Not necessarily, right? So by the 90s, the rating for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood came down to about half of what it was during its peak. So there was certainly pressure to try to keep up with the production of the time, but Fred wouldn't, and I don't think he refused to change because he was somehow stubborn and he had such ownership. He felt, and I saw that in the very first episode, that even if the world around you changes, that who you are deep inside doesn't change, and that the deeper needs of children, of families, doesn't change just because the world is getting faster and have computers and all of that. And he was there Just like at the very beginning in the 50s, he was called to serve the deeper needs of children and families. And he was going to stick to that no matter how the world is changing around him and no matter how much television is changing around him.
So in a lot of ways it became about his philosophy was, or his mission as he saw it, was to remind children who you are and that I like you the way you are. And it was more about focusing on feelings and dealing with certain experiences that come at you in life as opposed to academic learning, that like the kind you would get on Sesame Street or the Electric Company, these more modern, faster paced, more visually stimulating PBS shows that came along later.
That's right. I think Fred was not against academic learning for children. He likes to teach children all kinds of things. But I think he was against rushing academic learning very early on in life. So you notice when Fred in the episode said, well, you'll learn to write someday. He didn't say, well, you'll learn to write by 5, otherwise you'll be unready for kindergarten and we'll run a test and we're going to group you separately from the other children.
He wasn't teaching to the test, is what you're saying.
He wasn't. And I think Fred had a much broader view of what it meant for a child to be ready, not just for kindergarten, but for school. And for the things that Fred articulates as to what is it that helps a child to get ready, the first thing, he ranks them. There are 6 things, but the first thing is self-worth. That you need a healthy sense of self-worth. And the way I think Fred would think about it is, imagine a child goes to school, right? And the child starts to read, and reading was difficult. For a lot of children, reading in the very beginning, or doing anything in the very beginning is difficult. What keeps you going when the going is really difficult? Fred felt that it was a sense of self-worth. If you believe that no matter how difficult it is, that you have enough self-worth to keep going, to keep trying, then that's what helps you to be ready, not just for school, but for life itself. So in Fred's mind, helping a child developing a sense of self-worth, conveying to a child a message that the inside of you doesn't change and I like you that way, he was laying what he thought was the foundation, not just for child development, but for human development as well.
So we're here celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first nationally televised Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. David, how did Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood get picked up? What was happening at what later became PBS, but at the time, as you saw in the graphic at the end of the show, NET, National Educational Television? You know, what were they seeing in New York or hearing that told them that we've got to let the whole nation see this guy?
Well, National Educational Television was the first idea of saying we need money. There's something that we can. This is back when television only had CBS, NBC, ABC, and a couple of local stations. I mean, Dumont was already off by this point, a decade before Fox, and there was no cable. But stubbornly, some people thought maybe there's something we can do with television better than CBS, NBC, and ABC. What a shock. And what happened was that the government wasn't really for this necessarily. These are, we're talking 1968, we're talking, let's drop the name of Richard Nixon as president. And so there were hearings in 1969, the year after this program began, about whether or not NET, public television, should be funded with the creation of a public television service, PBS, a whole system that would work with Fred and some of the other shows that were being developed in Sesame Street and get them nationwide. And there was a real question as to whether that was money well spent. Imagine being so backward as a society that we would debate as a government whether it was worth funding educational television. but I digress. So back in 1969, this senator, John Pastore, holds hearings. He's the guy that got the Untouchables off the air when he went against violence in the early 60s on television. And so he wasn't so sure about this stuff. And who comes before the Senate hearing and before John Pastore but Fred Rogers? And Senator Pastore, you'd like a senator to be really well informed about the committee he was chairing. He'd never seen what you just saw. He'd never seen any episode of Fred Rogers. Been on the air for a year. And the guy was wondering whether or not to fund it, but had never seen it. All Fred did was describe it and then recite a poem and sing a song in real time for Fred Rogers. This was not Final Jeopardy. You know, he took the time, and at the end of it, this gruff old senator, back in these days when politicians would listen and people would talk to them and minds could be changed, I think the quote is, I think you just earned the $20 million. That's all that was at stake then. But that allowed PBS to continue. I'm sorry if that was too long-winded, but that's another one of those things, you know, and they're all here to look at the center. They've got these clips. It's amazing how much of an impact he had locally in terms of TV in the 50s, nationally in terms of TV in the 60s, and then all of PBS for 50 years might not have existed if not for Fred Rogers. And who's going to save it today? I joke, but there's no joke. It's at risk. And, you know, there is no Fred Rogers right now. Big Bird has been co-opted by HBO, so that doesn't work anymore. I think it's Ken Burns or nothing. You know, but you don't have to see anything more than what you've already sat here and watched tonight to know the value of public television in general and Fred Rogers in particular.
Marge, how revolutionary was Fred Rogers' approach to children's television, and what did it mean for children's television programming?
I think David spoke, and Junlei. I mean, he was he set the stage for a whole new way of being with children. None of the cartoon, I mean, with Junlei talked about how you know, there was some pressure to put a little more pizzazz, and you know, he held his ground. And so in that sense, I think, as Junlei, you could, you know, probably tick these off better than I, but certainly that was revolutionary. He talked once on Charlie Rose's show about 20 years ago, so after the show had been on 30 years, and he was asked by Charlie Rose, you know, what's happened with television? And he said two things that were just so stark and simplistic in some ways. He said, too much noise, and we need more silence. And he said, too much information, and we need more wonder. That sense of wonderment. And I think, in some ways, I use the word simplistic, but to take those concepts and to do the number of episodes that he did with the same pace, with understanding the child development framework for what he was doing. I mean, this was not just by the seat of his pants. He really understood very much what concept he was going to talk about, what the theme was going to be. And I had the privilege, I think many of you here might have, to watch a show in production. I mean, it was a half an hour to do a 2-minute piece, just to get it right, just to talk about, did we get, what were the words right? It was just fascinating that kind of time on precious TV was taken. So revolutionary to me is he was in some ways so predictable, but the messages were so clear to both adults and children. And that, to me, and many of the shows that were on at the time, you would be perplexed at what, the message might be. But you, as an adult and as a child, really got, I think, what he was trying to, in that week of episodes, talk about.
Junlei, you mentioned how, as time went on, after the peak of Mr. Rogers' success, the ratings started to decline. So was that show an island, or did he, at least for a time, have an influence on the programming that followed?
Fred had a huge influence on many people who later went on to produce children's television programs. So our colleagues from the Fred Rogers Company is here. The animated series Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which if your children or grandchildren are maybe seeing, were
My
produced.
grandchildren, yes.
It was produced by the producer Blue's Clues, which a generation of children earlier, and the producer Blue's Clues was inspired by Fred Rogers, and that's just one of the many examples. Mm-hmm. But I think, as David was saying, there's some really practical aspects he has changed. So his testimony in 1969 that helped us to establish public television, which creates this system of public television as we still have it today. These has, even regardless of content, these have practical implications for children and for families. If you notice, I don't know if you noticed now, when you watch that first episode, if your eyesight was good, in the corner you can see time ticking by. And by the time the episode was over, it was about 29 minutes. 29 minutes out of a 30-minute time slot. The remaining minute was left for station identification. What that practically means, though, is that children are watching a program with no commercial. Commercial-free television started then, and we still have it now. We hope to have it for many years to come. But imagine what it means to not have commercial in a 30-minute program. Because what happens in children's television is the moment you start to slice that program up with commercials, it's not just an interruption of time. What happens is that the content of the show will eventually start to serve the commercial, right? And that the content of the show, instead of educating, is eventually going to think about how do I sell this child, or at least the parent who's listening near the child, something, right? And so that completely transforms the programming for children. So even something as small as that program running for 29 minutes, right? And Fred was the pioneer for making that happen. That impacts children all the way to today, regardless of the program today have anything to do with Fred Rogers, just the fact that we can still have a slice of television that's commercial-free for children and for families. And so the implications from individuals that felt inspired by Fred, that continue to do that work, as well as to something as simple as having 29 minutes of programming out of 30-minute time slot, it just ripples forward, I think, for generations to come.
And if I can amplify that, because the programming before that, in the 40s and early 50s, the children's program was shameless. In terms of, I mean, they had, you think of Howdy Doody, you think of Rocky Jones Space Raider, there are commercials with Rocky Jones where the sponsor is Kraft Caramels, and the host, the person that the kids are trusting and is talking directly to the kids, then goes to a commercial and holds up 2 and 3 pound bags, 1, 2, and 3 pound bags of caramels, and explains how healthy they are because there's like a pitcher of milk in each 3 pound box. He doesn't mention that there's like 9 gallons of sugar or whatever the equivalent is. But, and then he says, does your mom have a big bowl of caramels on her table around the house? If she doesn't, tell her to. Now, it's completely different from the trust you get from Fred Rogers, who doesn't tell you anything like that. And for the longest time, no matter how much you loved the characters in the neighborhood of make-believe, you couldn't get them as toys the way that you could get other things on other shows. That universe has loosened up with generations and generations. But Fred was very particular. That was one wall he didn't want to come down.
I have a couple more questions for our panel, and then do you folks have some questions? Because we'll give you an opportunity to ask things that you're curious about to our panel of experts here. So the big question, and I'll let any of you chime in on this, could Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood successfully premiere on television, public television, in 2018, 50 years later?
What? All right, okay, they're both pointing at me, so I'll say this really fast. If he hadn't been on the first time, yes, because as a TV critic for years, way too long, what always stands out immediately and succeeds quickly is innovation, is something different than everything else that's out there. And then television, being stupid, tries to do something just the same as that different and doesn't succeed with it. Fred Rogers stood out at the time because he was singular, because he was, and I hate using this word, but unique. And if someone came along like that today, because we already had him, it might not work. If he hadn't come along before and came along today, I think it would, because like, what is that? Who is that that's talking directly to me as a kid, and that slowly? I would like to think it still works now. I will tell you, when I show any Fred Rogers clips to my college students, even the ones who did not grow up with him. And one thing I'm dying to know, my first question once we open it up to discussion is, how many of you watched as kids? But the spell still holds. He's still that slow talk. There's something so honest about it. And kids are honesty detectors. And I think that would work.
And David, you interviewed him and you asked him the question, what is the secret of your success? What did he say? How did he respond to that?
He said it was just honesty, if that's the quote that you're talking about. What did you say I said? He said. I talked to him like 25 years ago. I don't want to misquote Fred Rogers at a Fred Rogers symposium. What do you have down there?
I just have the question, but I along the lines of what you're saying, yeah, that he was, being honest and that there was no secret. There was no magic formula.
Can I, 90 seconds, and I swear then I shut up, okay?
David, it's not a radio show. You have all the time you want.
I probably 20 of you have seen a variation of this. This was one of Fred Rogers' most amazing tricks. If he was a magician, this would be his Houdini get out of chains trick. And I saw him do this when he was getting an achievement award from television critics. So there's about 200 TV critics in the room. As cynical a bunch of people as you can find outside of a Washington press corps, and they're there, and Fred Rogers gets up to give, his speech of thank you, and as he does on many occasions, he says, I'd like you to take a minute and think about the people who got you here to this point in your life. And then he says, I'll time you. And we laughed. Yeah, a minute. And he looks at his watch and shuts up at the podium. And 5 seconds go by and people are giggling. Then 5 more seconds, everybody's quiet. 5 seconds after that, you start to hear convulsive sobs, and there's still 45 seconds to go. Now, how many of you have witnessed a variation of that from Fred Rogers? Look, I mean, I don't care which audience he did that. It always worked with him. I don't know if it would work with anybody else, but what it says about him as a human being and him caring and wanting to reach each person individually, I don't know how you do that. I don't know. It's like those people at the circus who catch a bullet between their teeth. How do you get good at that the first time? How do you practice that? What makes you think that's going to work the first time you do it? I don't know.
Well, I want to sort of end this portion of the program with a quote that, I don't know if you saw this in the paper yesterday, but in the Post-Gazette, Rob Rogers, who is an award-winning, brilliant editorial cartoonist for the Post-Gazette, wrote about, because his last name was Rogers, kids used to come up to him when he was in school and say, are you related to Fred Rogers? And he would say, oh yeah, he's my dad. And he thought that was pretty cool. But in this remembrance, he said something that I thought was really moving, and I wanted to share it with you if you haven't seen it. Rob Rogers said of Fred Rogers, to those of us who tuned in every day, they became the building blocks of self-esteem. He taught us tolerance and acceptance before we could even say the words. If only more world leaders had watched Mr. Rogers when they were growing up, this world couldn't help but be a better place to live. Let's have a big round of applause for...
And to you too. Right back at you.